All right, just two more chapters to go in our study in Genesis. Jacob knew that his time on earth was rapidly coming to a close. As the patriarch of the family that God had made a unique and special covenant with, he knew that his sons were the ancestors of tribes that would form the core of a people named Israel. It was through them that God would fulfill his promise of a Savior, the Redeemer who'd rescue humanity from the curse. That promise had been given all the way back in the 3rd chapter of Genesis. Jacob wanted to ensure that his sons were left with instructions to follow the path of faith that his father and grandfather had taken. So he gathers them round his bed and lays out their future. In verse 1 we read, "And Jacob called his sons and said, 'Gather together that I may tell you what shall befall you in the last days. Gather together and hear, you sons of Jacob, and listen to Israel, your father.'" What's provocative is Jacob's use of the phrase Akarit Hayamim, translated here as the last days. I have zero confidence that I'm pronouncing that the right way, by the way. Those words are used repeatedly in the Old Testament to refer to the end times, when history reaches its climax in a time of global unrest, culminating in the coming of the Messiah to establish the kingdom of God on earth. Another phrase that's used for that same period is the day of the Lord. Now, what's tricky is that our translation makes it appear that Jacob speaks prophetically to his sons only about what's to come to them in the end times. It kind of has him saying, "Hey, gather round that I may tell you what shall befall you in the last days." The preposition translated in, it has a wider meaning than the English word. The idea here is that Jacob's words abide with each of the tribes from then unto the end. Ultimately, what Jacob means them to understand is that the nation of Israel will last all the way to the end of history. Indeed, they will be instrumental in the course that history follows because God's promises to them are the framework that all of history flows around. He begins by identifying himself both as Jacob and Israel, the conniver and the man of faith. Jacob's lived both identities and can see how both are still alive in him, just as you and I, as followers of Jesus, can see how it seems that at times there's, two people inside of us, the old sinner and the new creation. And there's a bit of both of Jacob and Israel in us, isn't there? As Jacob looks at his sons, he sees the same in them, the spiritual sons who want to walk by faith in God and the carnal sons who can't seem to let go of their flesh. So while some of what Jacob says speaks of the blessings of faith, there's also a curse on carnality. Their future will be determined by whether they're more like Jacob or Israel. Note that the printing renders the text in poetic verse here. That's because that's the way that Jacob spoke this. It was poetic. Verse 3, "Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and the beginning of my strength, the excellency of dignity and the excellency of power. Unstable as water, you will not excel, because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. He went up to my couch." As the firstborn, Reuben had the premier claim to the inheritance, but he had forfeited it when he gave in to his lust and had sex with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and the mother of two of his brothers, Dan and Naphtali. Jacob saw a troubling instability in Reuben that exempted him from being the one to carry the mantle of family leadership. As we look at the history of the tribe of Reuben, we see that it never really did excel. It provided neither a single prophet nor judge. One of the main qualities that God looks for in his leaders is a stable character. Verse 5, "Simeon and Levi are brothers. Instruments of cruelty are in their dwelling place. Let not my soul enter their council. Let not my honor be united to their assembly. For in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they hamstrung an ox. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel." So the next two brothers that are mentioned, Simeon and Levi, are linked because throughout their lives they seem to kind of pal around together. These are the two who came up with and carried out the plan to wipe out the men of Shechem in revenge for the rape of their sister Dinah. They were cruel hotheads. What made their anger immoral was that it was so self-willed, as it says there at the end of verse 6. Just as Jacob says here, these tribes were divided and scattered among the other tribes, but for very different reasons. The tribe of Levi redeemed itself by siding with God during the Exodus. Because the Levites refused to join the other tribes in worshiping the golden calf, God chose them to be his priests. Being priests, their duty was to serve God full time. So they didn't farm as the other tribes did. They either served at the tabernacle or they were stationed in various towns and cities around Israel, representing God there. Simeon, on the other hand, ended up being allotted the southernmost region of Israel, a barren wilderness constantly harassed by fierce desert raiders. The tribe was never really able to take its territory and ended up kind of blending into and merging with the other tribes. Now, verse 8. Judah, you are he whom your brothers shall praise. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's children shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He bows down. He lies down as a lion, and as a lion, who shall rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the people. Binding his donkey to the vine, and his donkey's colt to the choice vine, he washed his garments in wine, and his clothes in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine, and his teeth whiter than milk. So Jacob gives a rich blessing to Judah, his fourth son, and the one who, next to Joseph, had proven himself most capable of carrying on in the spiritual footsteps of his forefathers. Yes, for sure, Judah had a major bonehead episode with his daughter-in-law Tamar. He also was the one to come up with the idea of selling Joseph, but that may have been out of a desire at least to save his life. If they'd left him in the pit in the wilderness, as was the original plan, he'd have died of exposure. So by selling him, at least he knew that Joseph would survive. Judah had demonstrated that he'd learned the lessons his heirs had taught. He'd repented and proven it by offering himself in the place of his brother Benjamin when Joseph threatened to execute him for stealing his special cup. We studied that not long ago. In all of this, Judah's proven the leadership role of the firstborn ought to go to him. And so Jacob says the rulers of Israel would come from him. Their tribe would provide their greatest leaders, and ultimately the Messiah shall arise from the tribe of Judah. Verse 10. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the people. Now, a scepter is the emblem of kingly power and authority. It was originally a shepherd's staff. It represented the king as the shepherd of his people. The staff was ultimately shortened over time into a scepter, as it was something that was easier to hold. The king's scepter was so closely associated with his power that rulers used it to show acceptance or rejection. When a supplicant came before the throne, if the king extended his scepter, it meant acceptance. If he failed to extend the scepter, the supplicant was hauled off and executed for daring to bother his august personage. And so the scepter symbolized the power of the ruler over life. Rabbis and Jewish scholars have understood that what Jacob said in verse 10 is a prophecy of the Messiah. They therefore believe that he'll come from the tribe of Judah. Jacob calls Messiah here Shiloh, an archaic word meaning he whose right it is, or to whom it belongs. Israel's greatest king was David, from the tribe of Judah. His dynastic house provided an unbroken line of kings till the Babylonian captivity. Afterward, there was always a descendant of the royal family who acted as a governor under foreign masters like the Persians, Greeks, even the Romans. During all that time, Israel had the right of self-rule, including the power to exercise capital punishment, which in the ancient mind was the essence of the power of the scepter. But that changed in 70 AD. Herod and the Romans, in a bid to crack down on the growing unrest in the Jewish Sanhedrin, revoked their right to exercise capital punishment. The Jewish rabbis and scholars regarded that as a disaster of cosmic proportions, not because of the political ramifications, but because in their minds, God's word had been broken. In verse 10, Jacob prophesied that the scepter would not depart from Judah until Shiloh had come. With the removal of the Jews' right to exercise capital punishment, it seemed that the scepter had departed and the Messiah had not come. Or so they thought. The Messiah had come. And that's one of the reasons that we have the story of the 12-year-old Jesus going with his parents to Jerusalem for Passover. He ends up reasoning with the rabbis in the temple courts. That was far more than just a chance encounter. Shiloh had come and presented himself to them. but they had no eyes to see him for who he was, because he didn't appear in a form they expected. Well, Jacob went on to speak of the abundance of the tribe of Judah and all that it would enjoy because of the richness of the region that they inherited. Verse 13, Zebulun shall dwell by the haven of the sea. He shall become a haven for ships, and his border shall adjoin Sidon. Now, for some reason, Jacob doesn't stick with the birth order of the sons. He instead stays with the sons in the order they came from their moms. Both Zebulun and Issachar were Leah's boys, as were the first four. They were the 9th and 10th in the birth order. What's interesting about Jacob's prophecy here is that Zebulun's territory in the distribution of the land after the Exodus was not along the coast, as it seems to require. It was located between the Mediterranean and the Lake of Galilee, but it was landlocked. So what we see here is Jacob looking past the territory that would be assigned to the tribes after the Exodus. This is prophetic of the millennium, when the Messiah sets the borders of Israel as God promised. Zebulun will then have territory along the coast. Verse 14, Issachar is a strong donkey lying down between two burdens. He saw that rest was good and that the land was pleasant. He bowed his shoulder to bear a burden and became a band of slaves. Now, Issachar was the third largest tribe and occupied the center of Israel. It's a rich and fertile area south of Galilee. It's pretty flat. It connects the Jordan Valley to the coastal plain. And for that reason, it became much valued as a highway for the powers of the ancient world, seeking the easiest route between Egypt and the other centers like Mesopotamia. That meant that they saw a lot of invasions with people regularly carried away as slaves. Now, under good leaders like David, they rallied, made great troops who could defend their land, but they needed constant motivation from outside threats. Without it, they tended to be kind of lazy and fall prey to invaders. Verse 6, Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent by the way, a viper by the path that bites the horse's heels so that the rider shall fall backwards. The name Dan means judge, and this tribe did supply one of the most notable of the judges, Samson. Now, as anyone who reads Samson's story knows, he wasn't exactly a moral standout, was he? No mother ever told her son, you should be more like Samson. But God did use him in spite of himself. The Danites became a source of great evil in Israel. They were the first tribe to introduce idolatry. We read about that in Judges chapter 18. Then the northern city of Dan became a center of idol worship, as we read in 1 Kings 12 and Amos 8. Verse 17 has driven interpreters nuts, trying to unravel what Jacob meant in referring to Dan as a serpent. The reason why is because the Bible uses idioms and symbols pretty consistently. So when Jacob says that Dan is a serpent, we're obviously supposed to take that symbolically. So you tell me, thinking biblically, are serpents good or evil? Well, they're evil, of course, and in a pretty big way. It was a serpent that Satan appeared as and seduced Eve. God cursed the serpent. In Revelation, the devil is called that old serpent. So based on all of that, commentators believe that Jacob is saying that the Antichrist may be from the tribe of Dan. Daniel chapter 11, verse 37 and Jeremiah 8:16 lend support to that. In Daniel 11:37, we read this, He shall regard neither the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall exalt himself above them all. In Jeremiah 8, we find this, We looked for peace, but no good came, and for a time of health, and there was trouble. The snorting of his horses was heard from Dan. The whole land trembled at the sound of the neighing of his strong ones. Well, another piece of evidence that the Antichrist may be a Danite is that his tribe is omitted from the list of tribes of Israel in Revelation chapter 7, when the career of the Antichrist is in full swing. If this is a prophecy of the end times and the fact that the Antichrist comes from Dan, it explains why Jacob says in verse 18, I have waited for your salvation, O Lord. Jacob knows that Shiloh, the Messiah, comes to end the reign of sin and death, which achieves its consummate expression during the reign of Antichrist, as he's just foreseen. And so he cries out for salvation. The Hebrew word here, salvation, is Yeshua, translated as Jesus in our Bibles. So Jacob is literally calling for Jesus. I have waited for Jesus, Yahweh. Verse 19, Gad, a troop shall tramp upon him, but he shall triumph at last. The name Gad means troop. Gadites helped form the backbone of Israel's armies. But due to where they lived on the east side of the Jordan, they were frequently attacked by the nomadic tribes that lived in the very harsh conditions of the Saudi Arabian peninsula. Verse 20, bread from Asher shall be rich, and he shall yield royal dainties. The tribe of Asher settled in the very most northwestern region of Israel, a rich land for agriculture. This region supplied David and Solomon the lion's share of the materials for building Jerusalem and for provisioning the royal tables and lavish banquets. Verse 21, Naphtali is a deer let loose. He uses beautiful words. The tribe of Naphtali lies east of Asher, northwest of Galilee. This is gorgeous land and rich for growing. In ancient times, it had thick forests where an abundance of deer roamed. It also is the place that Jesus did most of his ministry. It's the region that saw his richest teaching. The Sermon on the Mount was delivered there, a place of, beautiful words. Now, we expect Jacob's words over Joseph to be the most expansive, and so they were. Verse 22. Joseph is a fruitful bough by a well. His branches run over the wall. The archers have bitterly grieved him, shot at him, and hated him. But his bow remained in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. By the God of your father who will help you, and by the Almighty who will bless you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that lies beneath, blessings of the breasts and of the womb. The blessings of your father have excelled the blessings of my ancestors, up to the uttermost bound of the everlasting hills. They shall be on the head of Joseph and on the crown of the head of him who was separate from his brothers. In our last study in chapter 48, we saw how Jacob gave Joseph the firstborn blessing by giving a portion each to his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Later in Israel's history, these two tribes were the most populous and together acquired the most land. And Jacob briefly reviews Joseph's history. Though unjustly abused, he maintained his faith in God, and God sustained him, prospering all that he did. Joseph is the main son to whom and through whom the promises of God to Abraham will flow. The course has been Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and now it's going to be Joseph. Verse 27, Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil. The tribe that came from Jacob's youngest son were great warriors, skilled in war with an inclination toward violence. We see that quite clearly in the book of Judges. Verse 28, all these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is what their father spoke to them. And he blessed them, and he blessed each one according to his own blessing. Much of what Jacob says to his sons in this chapter is arcane and difficult interpreting. That's because it's prophetic and won't be totally clear until the end times. Verse 29, then he charged them, and he said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field of Ephron the Hittite as a possession for a burial place. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife, and there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is there were purchased from the sons of Heth. And when Jacob had finished commanding his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed, breathed his last, and he was gathered to his people. Jacob's final instructions were to bury him back in Canaan, where his ancestors were. He wanted to impress on his sons the reality of God's promise. That was their land, not Egypt. They were only visiting Egypt. It was not their home. Now, Moses was careful to include this, along with what we read when Jacob's family first met and talked with Pharaoh. They'd come to dwell for a time in Egypt, not settle there permanently. Remember that word dwell, which Pharaoh agreed to, meant a temporary stay. Israel's enslavement by a later Pharaoh was illegal in that it ignored the agreement that Jacob and Joseph had negotiated with the ruler of Egypt. They ought to have been free to leave when they wanted. Jacob's desire to be buried in the cave of Machpelah, along with his father, grandfather, and his wife. made sure that his sons knew where they ultimately belonged.